Well, we'll start our roundtable that it's, I hope, a very good final of this two-day conference, this intense two-day conference program. I start to present all the members of this roundtable. Ladies first. Maria Trabulo is an artist living and working between Vienna and Oporto. Is currently conducting an artistic research on the importance of the forefootness in times of circulation. A study applied to technology and art practices with the support of the Fundação Carlos de Gulbenkian within the Art and Science Department at Faculty of Applied Arts in Vienna. Stell Nabera, in my left, is independent curator and writer based in Paris and Lisbon now, where she runs a project entitled Neumann. She is currently preparing a show that will open in June at Neue Archner Kunstverein in Germany. Axel Stuckberger, on my right, is an artist and theorist who lives and works in London and Vienna, and he studies at Faculty of Applied Arts in Vienna with Peter Wiebel and holds a PhD from the University of the Arts in London. Paulo Mendes is an artist and curator of exhibitions and producer of cultural projects who lives in Porto, has presented his work individually and collectively since the early 90s. Over 20 years, he has participated in numerous exhibits based on performance projects, and having curated and produced over 70 exhibits. For the last but not least, our artist that is the author of the exhibition at the moment at the Museum, Onda de Vulcano, Hugo Canoilas, an artist who lives and works also in Vienna, and he currently shows the Baixo do Vulcão that I hope that everyone has already seen at Museu do Chiado. It's a very short biography, but of course Hugo has a very long curriculum already in exhibitions, more international than in Portugal. This roundtable, the schedule will be, I introduce some three topics that I like that could be discussed after. Then each one will be a short presentation of some of points of view for this roundtable. The first one topic that I'd like to introduce is concerning the main subject of the title of this roundtable, the capitalism of disaster. That is a term stolen for Ito Starl, an artist and a theorist, who talks about what is the function of the art inside a system where the permanent change between cultural issues is also a fight of social classes. She introduces some aspects of this theory, saying that the problem with the contemporary art and the capitalism system that holds this system of arts is not only an economical problem, is also a social problem. The second thought that I would like to introduce is a more national issue that perhaps the other two participants could not discuss with more consistency than Canoilas, Paulo Mendes, and even Maria Trabulo. And it is a national issue that concerns the very historical difficulty that we have in the Portuguese society, in the public, and also in the cultural politics about the idea and the concept of contemporaneity. And I could give an example. Just by chance, during the last month, the exhibition of Canoilas was nearby, in the same building, and next, an exhibition of a vanguard painter, Portuguese painter, Amadeu de Sousa Cardoso, and this exhibition was 100 years after he made an exhibition in Lisbon. That was that was a scandal. The first exhibition was in 1916, and the exhibition was a scandal and was a very bad reception inside the Portuguese critic and inside the Portuguese society at the time. The presentation now of this exhibition, it is a replica of this exhibition of 1916 that was here at the museum, was a huge success. We have 4,000, that's right? 40,000, 45,000, 40,000. We have 40,000 visitors during the 1 month and a half. That was the time that during the exhibition. The curious about that is that almost these 40,000 visitors don't enter at the exhibition of Humanas. So they recognize the historical legitimation of the contemporaneity, but they don't recognize the contemporaneity in the contemporary times. So this is one of the issues that I like to introduce after about it also. The last thing is about a fascinating text by Walter Benjamin that the title is Experience and Poverty. When he talks about the period of the First World War and the huge heritage, cultural heritage that the Occidental society have, but the lack of communicational experience that they lived at that times. And this lack of communicational experience is not useful in the perspective of Benjamin to a ground to a cultural richness and a cultural progress of the society of his time. So it is only these three topics that I would like to introduce for further discussion also. And I will start to passing the microphone to Axel. That was the first one to speak with us.
So, hello. I hope you can hear me well. I don't know about the acoustics in the back there. Does that work for you? I'm quite happy to have so many people here. I think that's great in the afternoon, such a beautiful day outside. Actually, a few rays of sun for me too. In Vienna, where I came from yesterday, it's just dark and gray. So consider yourself lucky to be here. I don't have a lot of time to talk about the issues that I have been interested in lately. I will speak for maybe 10-15 minutes and then we will move over. Yes, first I would like to, as is customary, thank Emilia Tavares for inviting me and Hugo Canoyas, of course, for having me here. As was said in the introduction, I'm an artist but also a theorist, one of these double-horned beasts, or two-headed people writing, thinking about art, but also producing art. Throughout my work as an artist, as a practitioner, I always came across issues of discussing the value of art with other artists. You know, what makes a work important, what makes a work interesting, and so on. As a teacher, of course, this is also something that you're engaged with, to talk about the value of art, what makes a work interesting and important. And so in my recent research, I started to go back to a really old topic in art history, one of the major bones of contention, if you want, the canon and canonization. And I will just briefly tell you what I'm interested in here. So the book, which will hopefully be published soon, is called Manifold Destiny, which signifies this massive explosion that we're all witnessing at the moment. That, of course, has to do with fine art being engulfed, like all our other cultural practices, within the culture of the digital. And within this book, I'm trying to establish three, if you want, distinct forms, or you could call them also paradigms in this sense, in Thomas Kuhn's sense, of canonization. So you would have, and again I have to say I'm talking from a Western perspective here, of course there would be a lot to say about other potential perspectives, but if you start with the classic Western canon, for example with a piece that a lot of art historians are well aware of, Polykleitos Doryphoros, the Spear Bearer, the classic canonical sculpture from 450 before Christ, so I'm really way in the past now, yeah. What we have there is a piece that shows its rules. You know, you have this sculpture, you have this thing, and the rules are made explicit. These rules are also atemporal. They are supposed to be taken from nature, so they're not meant to change anytime soon. That's something, it's outside of history, ahistorical in that sense. And artists are meant to orient themselves and their work according to these works, to these sculptures, which they do, and some do that up until today. So the whole idea of a paradigm taking over is of course not to claim that an earlier paradigm is completely vanishing. It will maybe be there in parallel, but some way of thinking might take over. And this is what happens clearly in the 17th century or in over a longer period of time, starting with late 16th century, 17th century, with the inception of what Christeller has called the modern system of the arts. Namely all the institutions, one of which we are sitting inside today, the Museum, but of course also the art academies, art criticism emerging, patronage being switched over from the church towards a newly established bourgeoisie and so on, nation states emerging. I mean, there's so much going on, it's really hard to actually get a grip on this, but let's just think of canonization changing in the sense that now you have a lot more institutions and players and interests at play trying to decide what is good and bad and what to strive for in art, okay? So you have experts, writers, philosophers, aesthetics emerges as a distinctive field. You have the switchover in fine art from the orientation within this classic canon, which is to a certain extent also a system of geometrical rules of relationality, the golden rule, just to give one example, towards something else that becomes discursive and is highly contested. Of course, I'll quickly go forward now because I want to land somewhere else very fast, not having a lot of time to talk about this. A lot of these let's say, discursive establishments, and a lot of these, let's say, rules that are fairly stable over periods of time. If we just think of, for example, national canons and the museums establishing canons based on the idea of the nation state, yeah, you just have to think of Benedict Anderson and his work in this direction. The importance of the self-reflection and of a public, of a national public with certain cultural goods and so on. So you have all these, I call them gatekeepers to canonization, all these institutions who are sort of in an interplay working amongst each other. The market, of course, being one extremely important one. Here we also have to, we have fascinating things that we can see, for example, in the Dutch Golden Age period, and this parallelity that will lead us into the present of capitalism, namely the tulip crisis, people speculating derivatively on aesthetic objects, right? So that is 1640, 1650, something like that. But of course the market changes a lot of things and becomes an important gatekeeper to canon too. Now, what I was most interested in, why I did all this, going back into these old stories, trying to make some sense out of this, is because I'm convinced that something is happening at present that chimes in, to a certain extent, a different form of canonization. And this, for me, is characterized by digital culture. When I say digital culture, I am speaking about the way the Swiss cultural theorist Felix Stalder thinks about this. Most importantly, he doesn't think of digital culture as something that is technologically determined. So the idea is not that you have digital technology and because of this technology a culture is determined in a specific way. He rather turns this around and says certain technologies come to the fore or are developed in conjunction with certain economical, political, societal needs. So if you think of all the, let's say, if you go back to our topic, canonization, if you think of the massive canon critique that happened in the 60s and 70s of the last century, especially the feminist canon critique, post-colonial critique of canonization and so on, you can already in a way see this. There's a shattering of dominant discourses. There's a kind of opening up, and this in many ways, this kind of discussion that is started there is something that is at the heart, lies at the heart of digital culture for somebody like Stalder. So now what happens now? How can we understand canonization at the moment? Most interestingly, I think you have, it is characterized, if you want to separate it paradigmatically from these other two forms, ahistorical, antique canonization, a kind of teleological or historical canonization in modern period of canon. Contemporary canonization or forms of canonization are characterized by a specific relationship to time, by this problem of the now, of the contemporaneous. Peter Osborne has really shown this problem quite well, and I think you are also interested in this, particularly later, that might come up again. So what is this problem of the now? I mean, a lot of these gatekeepers that I've been talking about before, and artists themselves are interested almost speculatively or derivatively. I think the picture of financial trading institutions trying to control the future in the now is a good metaphor to think of this. Trying to create a presence in the canon of the now to a certain extent. At the same time, you have institutions which follow the market and attention economy and try to use this data to create some form of taxonomy that is perceived as canonical, something like artfacts.net, if you know this platform. What they do is really they base their point system that these algorithms use on the amount of shows that artists have had in different countries. So it's really about attention economy, and they mix that with market data, but they also mix it with the appearance of the name in certain critical publications and so on. So they're really trying to see what is the most talked about at present, what is the most shown at present, right? So I think this is an important change. It's not anymore this idea, or at least not in the foreground, this idea that the past will show us what emerges as the most important and the best. No, it has to be produced in the now, right now. Furthermore, if you think about audience and how audience are structured and have been throughout modernity, I mean, audiences were also made by museums, right? If you think about Tony Bennett, for example, and his idea of the exhibitionary complex, I mean, the museum as a pedagogical tool that actually brings about its own museum, its own public, its own audience. In an odd sense, if you look at digital platforms at the moment, who are also publics, they are brought about very differently. They are brought about algorithmically, and they are, in that sense, they fragment people to a certain extent, but also collect them in short-term communities where interests are exchanged and so on. The filter bubble, of course, Elie Pariser's famous term comes to mind in this context. What's important here is, and because I don't have so much time, I will directly come to this point, is that normativity, which is a prerequisite for evaluation, for judgment, right, is at present produced by algorithmic structures to a growing extent. So what we're confronted with is the creation of norms or of normativity, of, let's say, forms of meta-canonization, you could even call that, which emerge out of black-boxed structures. Because a lot of these algorithms are not clearly open to us, we cannot study them directly, people are trying to reverse engineer them to find out more about them, but they're not directly accessible to us, and they appear naturalized, so they are absolutely ideological or perfectly ideological in that sense. So if you do a Google search and think about the PageRank algorithm, Google, interestingly, at the beginning, and that was why it became so important, based its ranking of importance, the things you find, according to a so-called trust system. So they did something quite old in a way. They actually looked for already established institutions and people and made lists which were also part of this algorithm. At present, we do not know how much role or how important this trust system is within the Google algorithm, but it is most definitely something that we cannot ask. It's black boxed, yeah? But we all of us, I guess, are using this for our work daily and so on, and artists use it, audiences use it to find artists, to find works and so on. So these two moments, I think I want to probably end with this. One moment, a different time. Canonization at present has a different temporal structure, would be one argument. So this leads us to the whole nexus of the contemporary, this problem. And the second issue would be normativity increasingly not being arrived at or produced discursively, but rather rising to the top from algorithmic practices. I'm sorry, let's stop this here. So maybe I can have one more minute.
I give you one too.
Okay. So I think the point I want to make, maybe also for the discussion later, is a lot of people at the moment seem to be overwhelmed. I mean, if I think about myself, I don't know, I was born in 1974. In my lifetime, the world population has doubled. So there's simply a lot more people around. And during my time of studying as an artist, I've witnessed an absolute growth of artists. You know, there's more students, the amount of students has doubled. The amount of people taking part in cultural production in general has multiplied to a massive extent, which is fascinating and a brilliant development, I think, on the one hand. On the other hand, this, let's say, explosion of different platforms, which also has something absolutely aesthetic and beautiful about it, appears to many like a crisis, like the absence of rules. I mean, has been addressed like this since the 80s, like that. I would argue there is no absence of rules. They kind of return, as it were, through the back door to a certain extent. They return through the infrastructures that guide the ways we become members of audiences. And as a last point, I think this is also really important because it informs the way artworks are increasingly produced as referential structures. Since you have these different specific audiences, you know, people grouping around these ideas or those interests, works of art increasingly make their own little canon with references towards these different groups of audiences. and works that are successful in this manage to combine lots of different special interests, manage to talk to lots of different platforms, people, groups. And in that sense, also adhere to lots of different discussions, discursive formats, and also evaluative, let's say, platforms. Yeah, so maybe I'll end with this. And let's see what that means for the disaster of capitalism, because something we need to talk about.
Thank you. Do you hear me? Yeah, okay. First, thank you to Museu do Chiado for this invitation. I'm very happy, Axel, that you mentioned Christella, that I was studying a lot also when I was a student in art history, and especially coming from Vienna, it allows me to make a great link with someone I'm going to refer to now for this short presentation. I am unfortunately not an academician, so I'm not going to be so well articulated as you are. But it reminds me that Christella was very interesting in many ways, and especially the way that he built categories, especially from starting from the Renaissance time, and make me think of how we are shifting from those categories over those categories. Now we are shifting on the paradigmatically area through the times, and made me think that also since this period of time that Christella was so much into and studied so much into the Renaissance time, today every year art schools are graduating artists as much as the old Renaissance time. So this is also, I think, that we have to think about, like how do we now live with this amount of artists that are graduated every year. But I would like now to give my voice to a very good text that I've been very recently reading from Nora Sternfeld, that you maybe know because she is a teacher in Vienna. She's a curator and educator. And I would like to just go through a very interesting text that she has been very recently publishing in a magazine published in France from the Cadiz Foundation together with Villa Vassiliev. And the text is called Why Exhibit at All? An Answer from the Year 2030. So I'm going to quote some of this some excerpts of this text. And she's starting this text from an interview with Marcelo Rezende, former director of the Museum of Modern Art in Bahia. Everything has been touched by the political backlash. The fight is still going on, but the picture is very clear. Brazil is facing a putsch, a coup d'etat by the right and the far-right forces in the country. And as usual, in cases like this, the left has been unable to be, well, a real left. I have invited to leave the Museum of Modern Art in Bahia in late December due to the atmosphere my tenure as the director was described as a political menace by the new administration in Bahia. Why? Because we decided in the last 4 years to debate about the hierarchy between the museum, the audience, and the state. Mamba, so the Museum of Bahia, is a public museum, you see? Sorry, do you hear me? If it's too okay. I have been very much interested in what Nora Sternfeld is describing later in the text, and something that I can only agree with. That's why I am now quoting her in this short presentation, which was, I would call, like she is calling now, the authoritarian turn. I think that we are very much going through a time that we need to discuss what is political, let's say the political power is toward our artistical and cultural production. And I will go further with some other excerpt of this text, thinking that she's talking from the time 2030 as a fiction, looking at our nowadays period. Since we took over the museum, we have asked ourselves what we want to achieve with our work here. We had been fighting for years for a different exhibition practice. We have occupied universities and mobilized voters. Sorry, it's too close, okay. We have occupied universities and mobilized voters, thought post-colonial and decolonial theories, shifted the boundaries between art and political action.
Maybe, do you want to try with this one?
Yeah.
This one is better.
Okay.
Switch this up.
This is better? Okay. Okay, sorry. So I start again the last sentence. We have occupied universities and mobilized voters, thought post-colonial and decolonial theories, shifted the boundaries between art and political action, intervened in the politics of history writing, and demanded the government's resignation. Yet, for over a quarter century, our core concern has been imagining different possible museums. We have criticized existing exoticist and colonial collection, work on the history of the Western Museum and its entanglement with the production of racist knowledge, and demanding an improvement to working condition and new decision-making structure. We have addressed, critiqued, infiltrated, and even occupied museum. Then we decided to get together and do what we could. We seized a favorable moment and became a museum ourselves. For the past 10 years, we have been trying to understand the role of the museum in time for authoritarian political change. My research focused in the period between 2013 and 2023. It begins with the 2013 occupation of the Ludwig Museum in Budapest, which Orban's government put a stop to and ends with the 2023 collapse of autonomous institutional structures in France. I am particularly interested in the processes before and after the turn. Although my main focus is on Austria, over the past few months I have made a concerted effort to examine, collect, and understand as much as possible about events internationally. Over the years, the politics within most museums have changed. New cultural policies gradually led to the instatement of new directors and staff. Some changed their stances gradually and others more abruptly. I am mainly interested in the transitions. Before these changes, struggles of cultural political actors in many different places had led to funds being allocated to research projects that critically examined the history of museums and their entanglement in colonial history and racist discourses. I just want to finish with the last one. In January 2016, the author of a book entitled Capitalist Realism has taken his life in London. Mark Fisher worked at the Institute for Visual Culture of the then renowned Goldsmiths College at London University, where he found himself wrapped in the same contradiction resulting from the capitalization of critique and the systematization exploitation of his labor to the point of exhaustion. We had drawn attention to the fact that the given living and working conditions no longer allow us to grasp the present or articulate a present from which a future could be imagined. A multimedia section in the exhibition will feature a lecture held in May 2014, 2 years before he committed suicide, where he speaks of how the slow cancellation of the future has been accompanied by a deflation of expectations. Fisher's suicide marks a milestone in the creeping shift of the coordinates delineating of our possibilities of action, which were not always immediately discernible. In the early years following the authoritarianism turn, capitalism and authoritarianism and of exhibition on critical discourse were no contradiction. I will end here my small presentation. I just wanted to add one of this expression to the debate that will hopefully follow. That is authoritarianism turn, and I hope that we can somehow include this aspect that is, for me, like very relevant at that time, in a time that critical voices are very much silent, although we produce a lot of discourse. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Boa tarde. Thanks for having me. I will try to be concise with the research I have at my hands right now, and that I've been developing over the past year. And the working title is Newsfeed vis-a-vis the empty pedestal, toppling, reposting, and the reinvention of monumentality. And this all started with an interest that I had by the end of the massive protest period, where I started to, because the experience of this protest worldwide and the revolutions, talking about from 2003 till 2013, so starting in Iraq and ending with Ukraine, the experience of these events was mediated. So we watched the statues being toppled through videos. And this became itself a form of participation or acceptance. And so I started to think of the protest as something that became embedded in the collective memory, and how would it be for one to find these protests in the future, to dig them out of the internet, or if they could be represented physically. And this came from this idea of monumentality and toppling. I came across a collection of broken statues at a museum in Portugal, and these statues, they are not considered to be part of the things to be seen by the public. And what I did, so briefly just going through the work that I developed on this in last year. So I was going through this possibility of protests and images becoming embedded in one's mind. In this case, this was a broken statue that I digitalized, and this was a flag where I wondered if one was to, what would it be like to collect what is the example of what truth can be in terms of a representation. If I were to ask each one of you to represent a white flag, how would it be like? So what is this collective memory? And so these were in representations of protests. And so to come back to present time, and in May 2016, there was the statue of King Sebastian was toppled from the facade of Rossio train station, and the statue had been there for 125 years, and it was toppled because a tourist wanted to take a photograph with it. So till today, this place remains empty, and the fact that it was King Sebastian ends up being an interesting case, because this was a king that died very young. He disappeared when he was 24 years old, fighting in Alcázar Quibir in Morocco, and his body wasn't immediately returned back to Portugal. Yeah, so this originated, so because the body wasn't returned, this originated the myth that the king hadn't died, thus creating what the Portuguese now call this Sebastianism. And it's interesting because it's still a story that is argued whether he appeared or not, though. In 1582, there was an attempt to bring back his body. So, if in 2017 this King Sebastian is still a reference, and his body wasn't, the fact that his body disappeared, that there was no representation, and that now the statue is broken, even though I have to say that immediately. Days after this incident with a tourist, it was a copy appeared, and it is now being. It's now, from the information that I could find, it is now in process to perhaps replace the empty space. This photo was taken yesterday, so as I said before, the place remains empty. So I find it very interesting that. It is still possible that without an image, without a representation, without a body, for things to last for hundreds of years. And so King Sebastian was an incident, but Saddam Hussein's in 2003 wasn't accidental. It was on purpose. And this is what remains from Saddam Hussein's statue today. It's the statue was melted after it was toppled by the Iraqi people and the Western troops. It was fetched for metal, and one English soldier managed to keep a piece that is actually now being argued and demanded by a local museum in Iraq. They want to have it. To archive it and perhaps start to talk about what were these events in 2003. But even though and what I mean is that even though the sculpture doesn't exist anymore, I guess we can, all in this room, we can recall this event in 2003 to the toppling of the statue. And if you cannot, then you can just go to YouTube and watch it. Let me just. Yeah. So going to YouTube, and so the revolutions that were the protests that were archived online and visualized online, and this all remains there. So this information that we upload and that we allow people to visualize, it remains there. So the structure of internet is a bit like layers that overlap each other. So it is as well possible to lose information there, but one can always dig up and find other things. And what is interesting is that no one today cannot assure if the internet as we know it today, or the digital archives and the files that we own and this computer or this hard disk, if in the future in 10 years from now, we will be able to utilize them, because things are moving so fast, but still, hence there's a branch of technology dealing with what is digital archaeology that is specialized in keeping everything that there is in terms of hardware and software, so that in the future we can open. Because today, if one tries to open a file from 40 years ago, it's not possible. One needs to have the proper technology. So chances are that in decades, one will find these videos or these photos or what we post somewhere, and we'll probably be able to open them. But even if there wasn't another copy of King Sebastian's statue, today from photographs, so the photos that tourists would take before May 2016, when the statue was still there, it would now be possible to, with those photographs that are online, to reconstitute the statue and 3D print it. So there are a couple of examples like that of. This Factum Art in Madrid is a sort of factory specialized in reproducing artworks. There's a famous case of Caravaggio. This was a painting that was stolen or disappeared in the 60s, and Adam Lowe and his team at Factum Art, based in Madrid, they were able to reconstitute the painting and basically printed. So it is now possible to go back in time, basically to edit time, to take things that disappeared, that were lost, and recreate them. So I wonder, why do we sorrow a broken statue or a lost artifact if today we are capable of reproducing it? And I'm going to try now to shorten, to be very concise with this. So in January 2017, I visited the Bode Museum in Berlin. And the Bode Museum has a particular, because of the Second World War, in a very interesting story that I will. Yeah, if I tell it, then I have no time. So they lost, in a fire, they lost part of their collection. Around 400 paintings, and a third of the sculptural holdings were lost. And this bunker where the fire took place, the fire was right after the end of the war, and it was the bunker where they had stored the sculptures and the paintings that they wanted to keep. So they had selected from the museum deposits what should be saved in case of bombings. So this bunker was the safe place. So I was allowed to visit what was left from what they recovered in the end from this fire, and these were some of the pieces. And then in 2015, the Bode Museum organized an exhibition called The Lost Museum, where they said that where it referred to some of the artworks that had been lost, and some of them they recreated with plaster casts or printed. For example, the paintings, they printed them in the original format through the photographic archive that the museum has, and all of this then went online. So this is one of the Botticelli that was lost, and the original frame. And I can quote the curator, Julian Chapis. He said that The function of the exhibition in relation to the artworks was, as he stated, for the sake of retrieving them to history so that they could be remembered, even if their originals no longer exist. So to them, this was about putting these images, these artworks back into history. And I wonder, and I think this is an important exhibition, given the fact that already, so what happened in, okay. Yeah, I think this is a very important case given what's going on in Syria and what happened in Iraq and the lootings of the museum in Egypt. So this will for sure happen again, and these are cases that present. I will just show other artworks that were. This is, for example, the Gipsfommerei. It's the archive of Berlin with 7,000 artworks, copies of artworks, and this is, let's say, the physical archive of copies, which then this is, let's say, the digital version of that. So how museums are transforming themselves in adapting to the digital world. And what I would like to bring here is into the discussion is the importance of today one having a body. If it's important for one to be present when a king that died and whose body is still argued to exist, is still remembered, and when artworks can disappear and be recovered, be reprinted, be redone, and one can access them, can experience them, if there's a necessity for I don't want to say, yeah, if there's a necessity for a body, if it is that important. Okay. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. I'm beginning to show some images of my work because I'm right with images. That's my business. And I show some images of some of projects that I made in the last years. Images that simple think that some academical persons think that they are used just to illustrate their concepts. This is exhibitions that I made in museums. That's the reason that I chose these ones. This is in the Museu Neorealism. And what interests me in these spaces of the museums is the container of memories that they are. And what interests me in this series of the works, in this case, is the series of the works, call it Este Saudade, and is about the dictatorship in Portugal. And so what I'm interested is using the materials of the museum, the hidden items that are in backstage, things that people sometimes don't see, but that I want to use in the installations. And for me, it's interesting, or one of my interests is that the visitor, the spectator, use that space like a kind of performer and see that in the other way, the museum or the space that I show. I don't explain in detail the installation because we don't have time, but what I show here is things from my personal archive and other things that are in the context of the museum. Of course, in this case, like other places, in neorealism, museum, of course, are all the political scheme of that movement that is very, very important, and is a literary and cinematographic movement very important in terms of opposition to the dictatorship in Portugal. So, of course, that work have some to do with that team. I also like to make intersections with also with the museum, the space, and also with the installation. So in that exhibition, I make photographs of myself in that space of the museum, of the gallery, and use later in the other shows, in other exhibitions. Because it's a kind of, that work is a kind of on-the-road writing all over the years. This is in another museum in Braga, in a very conservative city. And this is an installation in the museum and a house of a very rich man in the time of the new state here in Portugal, Nogueira da Silva. And of course, what interests me here is that Salazar and Sergeira, the cardeal of the church, they go to that house several times. So one more time is that that's the space and the kind of phantasmagory that interests me here. To the people see the space in another way, because what I do is a kind of intervention in the space of the galleries that are permanent, not in the room that usually are used for exhibitions, temporary. What I put there is I work with the archive of that house, and use a lot of photographies and other things that are from the history of the house, and also about the history of that city and the relation with that story of that man, of Nogueira da Silva. And rearrange all the space with my objects, my paintings, my drawings, my objects. I make a kind of reenactment of old memories in that space. And also make more photographies of this person, that is me, with that name, Sr. S, Mr. S, a kind of icon of that time in Portugal, the time of dictatorship. And also this is the bed where Salazar stay, when he's come to the house. And another completely different thing is a big exhibition that I made, not in a museum, but in a factory, but with works from collections of museums. And I show that to show you some different ways to put the collection of a museum in a completely different context. This is that murals are from Uca Noilas, here present, in the entrance of that big exhibition, with the work of Harun Faroki. And in that industrial place with 3,000 meters, I show a lot of collections like Serralves, Museu do Chiado, Arte, Fundação EDP, a lot of them. And with very industrial materials, not in the usual way that pieces from museums are shown usually in Portugal. What interests me here one more time is the way that the people show the place and performing the space where visiting that exhibition. And of course, the meaning of the things, that the way that I put it, because this is a labor space, and that's the reason, because in the entrance we see the work of Harun Farocki working, leaving the factory, when others came to the factory, in the political event, because this is a big exhibition for Guimarães 2011, the Capital European of Culture. So in that political event, I want to people see that is a work of labor, not just a big event for the politicals to make an opening more. And I mixed all over the space the different works of the collections, like here, with also with fake artists and also fake works, because some of that works that you see in the wall are mixed with false paintings from the policy of Portugal that they are arresting from fakery. And in the last day, I make a big dinner with all my team, the production team, in the middle of the exhibition. During the period of that, the last people that can see the show are around the space, and this is the ending. Workings leaving the factory, and the workings there making the last dinner. And this is the book of a big one with 600 pages that is the result of that project. And to finish that images, another different project about Ernesto Sousa that I made last year in Museu Berardo. During 1 week, I invite people from a poor neighborhood in the same region of the Museum Berardo in Belém. This is people from a social housing, and the people from there work with me during 1 week to make an installation in Museu Berardo. I have nothing when I came to Lisbon. I just talked to some of them before, and I go to them to choose things around the space, and I make this big installation with videos, with sound installations, with some images that they give me from their families and their history. And I put all over in the entrance of the collection of Joe Berardo that I think is not, perhaps don't like very much, because it's not the same aesthetic of Florence Weiner and other very beautiful and formalist things. And what interests me also is that people from that neighborhood, the name is Bairro 2 de Maio, and they occupy that buildings after the revolution in '74, and now are the houses of all them. And I make some interviews with some of the people that are showing in the exhibition. And I just want to talk just 2 or 4 minutes more about some ideas about the museum that I put here, about the idea of inclusion and exclusion. Because I think I think today is the museum wants to include everything. And of course, like other people said, this is a way to make a kind of neutral discourse of everything. Everything is the same, and all that kind of institutional marketing about things like feminism, gay politics, post-colonial, cultural identities is a kind of melting pot that all the museums put together, and sometimes is a way to make a kind of normalization of everything, and to a kind of silence to more experimental things, and make a kind of specularization of the museum, because the consequence is, of course, more public, and more public signified more money for the museums. And this is what the museums want today, because they want to survive. And that is the culture is more numbers that are contents and density of thinking. And this is one of the big problems of the museums and all the system today, I think, because the people just think in numbers and not in the real action. And for now, I think it's all.
For those who don't know what I've been doing, my work is above all regulated by an heterogeneity of content, forms, and platforms of work. So I've decided to take the risk of drop a little stone on a lake that is this normalization of art and normalization of these courses, and the possibility that we, with our good intention, might just create a cloud that stays above us without consequences. So take it as a provocation for a more honest discussion about the real contingencies of what we are dealing with. If I was against curators, I would impersonate Thomas Bernhard, and I would say, it's really cold in here. It's really cold in here. He made that during a speech, repeating it till people start to be really upset and shouting at him. I will focus on a position of the artist that has the opportunity to ask for attention for a little condition that is still happening in the production of contemporary art. I remember discussing this symposium with a director of a Portuguese institution that told with a very normal face, looking into my eyes, asking, I don't know what artists are doing in a symposium as such. I also will speak in the way I'm going to speak to avoid a sort of futurology or a sort of messianic discourse that say the future of museums will be as such and such. But I want to have the bombs very close to my body. I want to have the dynamite very close to my chest. As an artist, basically, I seek for an horizontal relationship between all agents of art. Artists must be heard or at least studied. The mediators of the art world need to do more field work like anthropologists or socialists do. Following Sartre's idea about the true intellectual, let's say a true intellectual for Sartre would be an intellectual that let himself go with the people during a wild strike. And that with, in a second moment of distance, would offer something to this movement, by his technical knowledge. What I'm claiming is that art, the whole, because art as part of a whole, so art and politics as parts of the same whole, that the main problem has to do with this whole being built from the unit to the whole. Contemporary art cannot be permanently, sorry, I lost my text and this is bad. Or else I get very nervous. So, contemporary art cannot be exclusively shaped by external agendas. That in a tangible level, that can happen on a tangible level, by being invited to be part of a certain exhibition with a certain agenda, or by the visibility that certain agendas have, which create a kind of anxiety to be part of this whole. And I'm saying this with the belief that art for me is what I believe, and it's also the negation of my belief, and it's also all these bits that fulfill this dichotomy. So I want art to be elastic and to be an image that is a space of convergence of difference, which is the opposite of what we are talking here about normalization. I champion art as something that happens here and now, being a contemporary artwork or a historical piece. I think historical pieces must be permanently replaced and restaged in order to have, through a sort of poetic immanence, being here and now, happening in front of us, that will allow for us to territorialize it again with social, artistic, or political events. Specialized public are accomplices of this event that is art happening here and now in front of us. The wider public, the general public, are the testimonies that make art happen. Art needs testimonies to exist. The real matter of art is interconnection between things in a different way of communication. Art can, through the opacity of its language, relate concepts, ideas, people, and events in surprising, not always rational, current, not possible to grasp a priori, following a road that is more and more oppressed by the rational. And this can be directly taken by all of us as the urge to create a discourse by the artist, so you can relate to the mediators that are always in between us and this public. I say this these new ways of relating things are possible a new light over an object or a concept, which creates a new shadow. And I'm saying a new shadow because of this idea by Sergio Solmi that a clear idea is a dead idea. An idea that is totally comprehended, understood, is a dead idea. And the dead idea is something that will be more easily instrumentalized by the political system we are living in. We are also in an age where information has already far more value than a monetary exchange that art comprises. So for me, what matters is to understand in which side of the system we are, in a way. Are we working towards a commodification of art, and commodification not being anymore so important for the little business that the art world, the contemporary art world, is compared to the historical art world? This is like a little percentage of money. Or are we working towards a resistance towards the codification of difference that democracy and capitalism champion on our everyday life? The possibility of working with an ethics of work that is a sort of mimesis between the artistic and the social political is my individual position. And horizontality is where all the implicated agents, from artist to curator to director of museum to the Ministry of Culture, etc., are active voices to an end that is undefined. So I say that this course must start from this unit towards the whole. And this unit, it doesn't belong anymore just to the artist or to the person who made, in the old days, there would be someone who would ask an artist to do a certain thing. This unit can be triggered by an artist or a curator, it doesn't matter. What matters is the clear distinction between a process of work where the means are active voices for this end, or the means are transparent languages to an Apollinian and idealized end, which would be politically a fascist regime in ideal political terms. I make it short because I think we have a lot to discuss.
Interesting.
Okay, we want to open the discussion. I want to know if someone wants to put some questions. There are a lot of teams here to... No one? Just us? Okay. Well, behind this, all these so several things, perhaps I start with something that Estelle was saying about the authoritarian turning point. That there is a concept that I would like to understand more in this context of the publication that you have mentioned. because it seems that in all the brief communications that we have here, in some points we are talking about authoritarian issues, authoritarian processes. There are more. You have spoken here in these 2 days also about the museums must be more critical inside to outside. There must be critical institutions about these own rules, programs, behaviors in the state of the art. I want to know if this authoritarian turning point is something that could be an answer. What kind of answer could be to this criticism that is going to be part of the contemporary art, of course?
I don't have any answer to that. No, you can. I mean,
no, I'm passing it to you.
Well, I was giving the voice to Nora because I feel very close to it, and I think she's pointing a thing that we are all living, but we are not. We're always talking about terms like anthropological terms and so on, and I think it's something that is very relevant and that we should point. I came to this thing really because this last 2 or 3 years I've been facing this very much also as a curator, as a freelance curator, but also I have been working a lot in different institutions, mostly in France, and one of the last was in Le Magasin. Hugo was part of a project when I was working there together with Lily Renaud-Devar, and that was called Proletarians. Performance Proletarians. So this is quite interesting how the institution can sometimes also include the very critical turn, and also there is a big gap between the practice and the theory. At the time, I was the head of a curatorial program that is called l'École du Magasin, and I was a student of this program many years ago. It is very interesting because it was the first curatorial program in Europe. It opened 25 years ago. And Le Magasin has been going through a huge institutional crisis. They fired the director. It was very, very messy at the time. Hugo also came, and they now have appointed a new director that is very much including all this theory of post-colonial feminist theory and being very much inclusive towards this important subject, but also completely denying at the same time. And this points me what Hugo just said about having a clear idea and how clear ideas can be taken so well by political. This is exactly what is happening. Like the critical turn is getting eaten by the political, and unfortunately, I just wonder how much we are critical in that sense. So this is also a question mark for me. Is also what are we going to do with that, and what is the conclusion of that? What are museums going to be, art centers, and so on? Now the situation that I'm talking about, what I experienced in Le Magasin is that l'École du Magasin has just disappeared. The new director has decided to quit the program, and this is a huge subject. What are we doing now with all these artists that are getting out of art schools every year when there is no mediator anymore and no one to circulate between the institution and the independent working areas? This is my background, and I don't know what's coming next. I don't know if you want to say something? Yeah?
Maybe, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I think there's a number of important things connected to this and also to your question. And I've been thinking, for example, if you follow Hito Steil and some of her ideas about institutional critique and what that meant in the 60s and 70s, the point she's making in a number of texts is that she's saying this institutional critique was possible on the basis that these institutions were funded by the state at the time. So you could find out if these institutions are funded by a democratic state, supposedly democratic state, funded by all the citizens, then why is it there's only men running the institutions? Why is it that there's only certain rich people in the institutions that run it, and so on and so on? So these relations of power can be asked on that, can be critiqued on this basis. Of course, with the latest waves of institutional critique, you do not even, in many cases, you don't even have these public institutions anymore because the states are retracting. The neoliberal structure is basically taking its money out of this field. It's becoming privatized and so on and so on. So critique also has to take place in a slightly different public. You know, it can't be based in the same public anymore. That is one of those issues that I think is critical to address. Another issue I have been thinking about a lot lately is this problem that fine art proper has, in a way, due to its short history since, let's say, the 17th century or 1650, when it was basically installed as something, as a matter of distinction, to distinguish a social class from another social class, to distinguish people from other people, and this is built into fine art, isn't it? So in a way, the idea of the absolute opening and inclusion also means the end of a particular idea of fine art, of the fine art system. I think we have to really be as radical and go that far. Do we want that, right? What does it mean if we want that? It also means that we give up all the classic ideas that are still with us, that are still kind of informing our idea of contemporary art, namely the idea that art is original versus following rule-based logic, that there's a difference between artisanship and fine art, and so on and so on and so on. All these borders, all these things that still define to a certain extent what fine art is. And from there, I want to make a short jump, if you want, towards another element that I think is still deeply informing how artists understand themselves today, but increasingly more members of the public understand themselves like this. And that is a deeply, I think, romantic idea, namely the idea that your life has to become a narrative that you're responsible for, and not only a simple narrative, but an aesthetic narrative, right? And nothing else. This is what people try to show on Facebook, that they are working super hard on making their life the best story that is possible. But this is increasingly harder to do in an environment that gives you pre-produced packages. How can you produce a unique story if you're given over-coded blocks? And these coded blocks, or these, let's say, formats, and I think really formatting is probably a good way of thinking about this, because what capital needs, what capitalism needs, is formatting. This is where this normalization and these, I mean, the terms are all connected, interconnected with each other. Normalization you talked about, right, comes from. Capital needs this. It's a bit like capital or capitalism, global capitalism works because of formats, because things can be repeated, quantified, and so on. You know, it works because you have the same container type that goes everywhere and looks exactly the same. So there is an inherent problem with this and fine art, because fine art is basically, if it is so deeply
indebted to this romantic idea of producing the authentic, the unique, the singular, and the original, the new, the different, that which is indeterminate, then it will always run against the overcoded and the formatted. It's basically something that escapes at all times. It cannot work. And in that sense, I would argue, and with this I will close this, I would always argue for value, for thinking about which value art and artists can produce by their work and within their communities, with the participating audiences that you talked about, let's say, and simply should not fall into this trap of letting others define value in monetary terms, because it's simply, the value is already there. And this is something that could be absolutely, you may call me naive, but I think it's the opposite of naive, actually. People call me idealist for this. I think it's the opposite of idealism. This value is already there. We know it's there. It is important for our lives. It enables us to live precarious lives. I think we are not powerful enough as artists to tell wider society, to solve the economical problems for them. What we have is a system of values, of things that we think are important. And so, it's really important to repeat and repeat and repeat this moment that, we have this, we simply do not need and believe in this secondary system of evaluation of monetary value that other people find so important, right? For me, this is really an important case in relation to capital. Similar, it has been said, capitalism really sits on top of all the existing value systems. No? It's like the family, personal reproduction, everything that is going on that people can have to do in their lives. It simply sits on top of that and takes away things from there. If you look at it from there, it becomes a bit easier to engage with it, I think.
There is a question in the audience.
I don't know if it's a question or it's like it's what I'm thinking about. But Hugo was discussing about the value of the undefined and the incomplete, and I wonder how can a museum really support these values? And it seems nowadays that museums are the places where artists' products are presented or misrepresented. And I wonder if this can change, and the only way we can move forward is to make the museum the place where art is made, actually. So the place where artists inhabit this place and visitors come to see how this thing is materialized in the first place. I work in museums and I see many visitors that they really don't care anymore and they cannot connect, and all us that we are professionals in the field, we think that we do something that matters, but the truth is that the public doesn't care. And I think it's because we most of the times present something that is already finished and not the undefined and incomplete that is valuable, as Hugo clearly talked about.
So I will answer this one. I will have to speak about my experience in this museum. So the project that I have there as an exhibition is a far more extensive project that was developed for a year and a half, and it gained its form through thanks to the openness of Emilia to work with me in this horizontality that I was talking about. So it was very important for me to do a project with, I'm super grateful to have the honor of doing a project with such an extraordinary budget for Portuguese reality. And I felt that responsibility, and I felt that first what I would do is not to present or to celebrate a work that people would recognize as mine, and I would jump into the void and do a film for the first time. So we were all, Emilia had to close her eyes and jump with me into it. And that is amazing, but that doesn't mean that the public will understand that void, because we live in a society that doesn't understand what happened between the last Taschen book that talks about post-impressionism artists and today. There's a huge gap because we don't get space in the media. We don't have an active voice in TV, radios, whatever. So work is coming in a way that it's not part of it. So in my opinion, the only possibility is to think about strategies that could initiate the public without making minor or less dense work, but using strategies that could initiate the viewer to make him feel that he's part of it. In my case, it has to do with the display. It has to do with the fact that as soon as the narrator says they are walking very slowly and with one hand on the other, and they are not. They are walking fast and each one like separate. So people became active and they start to fill the narrative gaps. And they start to be engaged even if they don't speak out, but they start to speak inside of their heads and projecting themselves into the work. So for me, I'm a huge Elio Oiticica fan as an artist who came from a background and having a work that was taken as very eclectic, elitist, belonging to this system of values that the art system somehow prevail. And through his experience within the popular people who live in the favelas, changing his work to a participatory event that made people, through the experience of the work, through the usage of work, through the experience of the time of the work, they can understand what's going on. And because the most important thing is that the work gets in and transforms the perspective of people towards the outside world. I don't know if I answered.
If there is any more answer for the audience? Paulo, tem alguma coisa? Tem coração. Yeah, you have a question?
Yes. Okay. Hi, I have a question for Maria Trabulo. We are talking here about capital and capital disaster, and we talk about big data archives and how these archives are kind of the next capital that are controlling us. And this is how, when this black box that we talked before about this big data that we don't know how this work, we kind of have a black box inside our brain too, that we don't really understand how does it work. How is possible, why people are so desperately trying to not forget something, when forget could be something very healthful for our black box or our brain, mainly today that this capital system have kidnapped us to this constant movement.
Well, I think it is above all related with the fear that I think we all have of beyond dying to not be remembered. So this fear that after once our body is gone, we won't become a myth, so we won't become monumental. So and hence this, I think that then this originates. What is this? Then the cult of personality. So referring to when the cult of personality transfers from the political sphere to the social sphere among ourselves, and then it starts to impact with the others, causing accidents or destroying. But going back to the need of forgetting, this is what I question as well. If gaps are important, if we shouldn't allow voids to be filled themselves with something else that is to come. But that's not the sort of behavior that I see nowadays. What I observe from ourselves as humans and users of physicality and digital and the virtual and museum-wise is that we've become obsessed with keeping things, and perhaps because we also forget them more. We forget them because we are constantly overwhelmed with new information, and the way the way the brain stores information. So this big data here has also been transformed by the big data on the other side of the screen. So I think it is a combination of this fear of being forgotten, the fear of not being able to remember, and this reliance on hardware and softwares to store things. And like there's for example, there's a museum in Japan that is its intention. So the purpose of this museum is to wait for the apocalypse. So this museum waits for the total disappearance of humanity, and that this will remain. So in case of loss of all information, whether it is physical, virtual, digital, whatever, in case we disappear and the artworks disappear, this museum states that it. So I have to explain what they have. So the museum has a sort of Abi Warburg version of Western art. So this atlas.
What's the name of the museum?
It's the. I'm sorry, I have to. It's the Otsuka Museum of Art. Otsuka Museum of Art in Japan. Yeah, and so what they exhibit there are one-to-one copies of Western art and archaeological artifacts, starting from Greek vases to the minimalism, and they've selected what would be the ideal examples of Western culture in case of the apocalypse. And so they've digitalized the artworks, so the Sistine Chapel is there, even artworks that no longer exist are there, because they've managed to reconstruct them. And they say that for 2,000 years, those artworks, or those representation of artworks, will be there in case there's a need to understand who we are, who we were.
There is someone left to sit.
Yeah.
Okay, I don't know if there is more questions in the audience. If not, we have a long time here. Time is a luxury, as you say many times. But you cannot spend it at all. So I invite Sandra to finish this long journey. I wish to thank you for your participation. Thank you to five. I don't know if you want to add any more things. You wanted?
I think we should go out for a beer afterwards.
Well, thank you very much. I want to make a last thanks for the people, the teams of the museum again that make possible the realization of this event. Give thanks also to our main sponsor to this event, Foundation Millennium Foundation. Also the support of Altis Hotel where many of our guests are staying. For the team of the museum again, and Sandra will do the last acknowledgements about it.
I would like to thank the keynote speakers, moderators, the public and the attendance of the conference, and the team of Museu do Chiado and the Art History Institute. Ana Celeste, Glória, Patrícia Melo, Ana Francisco Bernardo, Inês Louro, Cristiana Batista, Anabela Carvalho from Museu do Chiado, António Chaparreiro, Rita Sá Marques, António Rasteiro, Angelina Pessoa e Sofia Canho. Muito obrigada e até à próxima, que seja breve. Bom fim de semana.